Hello everyone, and welcome back to another solo spooky story. My name is Rob, and today I'll be your host. For anyone that doesn't know, the solo spooky stories are short episodes, usually anything from kind of 9-10 minutes to about 15-20 minutes. And yeah, it's mostly just me just talking about something that I'm particularly interested in, something that is by its nature, as I said, a short story, short episode. And, you know, they generally don't have enough content in them for a full-length episode between myself and Suze. And yeah, so with that said, I hope you are having a great day whenever it is that you're listening to this. And, you know, we'll just get into it. So one of the recent episodes that myself and Suze recorded, which at the time of recording this may not actually be released yet. So you'll get a little peek behind the curtain of what's coming up. We talked about a demon who is summoned through Ouija boards. And as we were kind of talking about this, we were talking about the use of Ouija boards and the kind of the history that goes with it and just the kind of general interest that we had in it. And I even said at the time, and I've maintained now for pretty much the entirety of this podcast, that I generally don't have much interest in doing a Ouija board. It's not really something that I'm particularly fond of doing. It's not that I really believe in ghosts or anything like that, or demons. It's more I just don't necessarily want to find out that I'm wrong about it either. So I've generally taken the approach of, if I don't really do a Ouija board, I'm not going to find out that I'm wrong. And I think that's a fairly healthy approach to take to these things. You know, it's done me well so far, and I don't really feel any need to test that so far, unless anyone has any points that they'd like to make, or a particular case or argument that they'd like to make to sway me one way or the other. I'm all ears, but as it currently stands, I have no interest in doing a Ouija board. However, as we were talking about this demon and things like that, you know, I was just looking around, kind of doing a bit of research on all of this, and I'd also previously done an episode on the Fox sisters, who famously were mad for doing a bit of seances and basically made the modern spiritualism movement that we have today. And while I was looking at them, we talked about, you know, the approaches that they took to, as I said, seances, communicating with the dead, the rapping and things like that, and, you know, the knocks and all this sort of stuff. And as I said, yeah, the spiritualism that we know today generally comes from the Fox sisters. So both of those things in mind, I guess I've just been kind of like looking into these things a little bit more, just to kind of see like what the crack is and kind of see if there's anything else out there that I wasn't aware of and things that, you know, could be good to present on. And I found something today that I heard about years ago, and I kind of just put it out of my mind, to be perfectly honest with you. And it was one of these things that I actually forgot that I knew about it until I was reading about it, and I was like, hang on, this sounds a bit familiar. And then the more I read into it, I was like, holy shit, I knew about this basically this entire time, but had just completely forgotten about it. And yeah, it was just mad interesting. So what I'm talking about today is called the Philip Experiment. And firstly, it's a great name for a band. You know, can't go wrong with some sort of like alternative rock band just called the Philip Experiment. It's a phenomenal name. You know, I that alone would be 10 out of 10 for me. But what I really appreciate about this story is that, yes, it's creepy, but there's more to it. And there's actually a lot more to it. And there's more, I suppose, science behind it than anything else, which is, I just find fascinating. And the whole thing about this is that there was a scientific approach taken to seances. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get into that, though, I just want to talk about some things that I discovered in looking this up and kind of setting the scene for what it is that I'm going to be talking about. So, as I said in the currently unreleased episode, belief in ghosts and things like that dates back to pretty much the earliest days in human tradition. You know, I'm sure there was probably stories of ghosts and ancestors long before we developed even the ability to write and record history. And, you know, it's something that we all love. We love a good ghost story, particularly in Ireland. Like, we're mad for them. Bit of folklore, we love it. When we were recently talking with the beer ladies, we talked about my absolute just hatred of the Banshee and the trauma that I have from that. Carrying around that childhood trauma like a good Irish boy. And yeah, so we all love a good ghost story, and there's always been ghost stories in human history where, like, even I suppose if you want to, and I'm not going to delve into it too much, but if you want to look even at the Bible and things like that, there's the elements of like coming back from the dead and ghosts and all that sort of stuff. I'm not weighing further into that though, so don't come at me, Bible folk. And yeah, so the thing about it as well is that the human brain as it is, like, we're always trying to find patterns and we're always trying to be rational in what we're doing, but we just have this innate ability to still somehow believe in ghosts and love the stories about them. And a shocking thing that I discovered was a 2019 poll that was conducted online in the States. I think it was YouGov or something like that. They'd concluded that nearly half of all Americans believe that ghosts and demons exist. which is just mad. Like this, yeah. When I was reading it, I found it mental. Like, just fair play, firstly, for holding your beliefs like that. But the interesting thing about it was nearly half of Americans believe that ghosts and demons exist. However, belief in religion and like scripture and all that sort of stuff is dropping significantly, which doesn't compute, I think. Or I guess it does, clearly. But for me, the belief in like religion and all that is dropping, and the stories of life after death and all that. But then the belief in ghosts and demons is kind of maintained or increased in some way. Weird stuff. Just really, really interesting. But then obviously when you look in like popular culture as well, we all love ghost movies, you know, like Paranormal Activity, The Conjuring, all that sort of stuff. And then with like demons, you know, Sinister, all that. We all love those sort of films. They're great. They really get your brain ticking. And I think it's something that people just enjoy, that kind of being on the edge of their seat, that kind of horror element to it. You're not necessarily enjoying the feeling of being terrified, but you love almost like the thrill that you get from it. I've literally just described it thriller, I've just realized. But yeah, we love them, we're big for them, and that's what this story is today. So the Philip experiment was this experiment that was conducted by a Toronto parapsychologist, Dr. Aor George Owen, and another psychologist, Dr. Joel Witten. So already you're off to a great start here. You've got a parapsychologist in here whose job it is basically to look at the weird shit that goes on in the world. Love this. Immediately I'm sold on this. So the two of these psychologists team up, and they decided that they were going to create a fictional character. And more so, this character was going to be a ghost. And their whole scientific approach to this was that they were going to basically, through their own kind of deliberate methodology and following the rules of seances and things like that, that they would effectively try to communicate with this character through a seance. But just to emphasize, this character is created by them, just to really emphasize this. So the research team, it also consisted of Dr. Owen's wife. Her name was Iris. She was a designer, I believe. And then there was also a few other professionals there. An engineer, there was an accountant, and I think a student was involved in it as well. But yeah, it doesn't matter. So basically they brought in these kind of professionals from all walks of life. And yeah, so they introduced them to what they were doing. They, wanted to talk to them about this. They brought them in and kind of told them what the plan was, effectively. And so the group that came together, they decided that what they were doing was they were not just only going to try to perform a seance and things like that, but they also were going to create this character. And what they settled on was a character named Philip Aylesford, so Philip Experiment. And they called him Philip throughout this experiment. And they went one step further. So they not only just created an identity for him, but they created a history for him. And this was an unbelievable history. It sounds like this lad had an unbelievable life. He was great. So they decided that Philip was born in England in 1624 and that he served in the military throughout his kind of younger adult life. And not only was he serving in the military as a young man, he then became knighted at the age of 16. So Philip doesn't fuck about. Like, Philip knows what he's about. He knows what he's doing. He's got that dog in him. And Philip went on to serve in the English Civil War, where the parliamentarians and the royalists basically went to war over issues around England's governance and their record on religious freedom and all that sort of stuff. And I won't get into it too much, but the important part about this is that he allegedly met and later became a close ally of Charles II, who was the king at the time of Scotland, England and Ireland, until he was deposed from the throne in 1651. He then returned in 1650 as king and remained there until his death in 1685. So that's just kind of, he was basically a young man, served in the military, became a knight at the age of 16, met the future king, best mates with him, pretty much. But Philip, even though he was friends with the king, he didn't really have much time for Charles's rule, because he met this girl, he fell in love with her, and she was from the Roma ethnicity, and yeah, they were married and all that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, while she was married to him, she was accused of witchcraft and was burned at the stake. Philip, just completely broken up by all of this, decided that he was going to commit suicide in 1654 when he would have been about 30 years old. So super detailed history of this man, Philip Aylesford. Really detailed history. They went all out. Fair play to them. They knew what they were about. They, 10 out of 10. gold stars all around for everyone for creating this history about him. And it's a good history to start with. So they've got this knight whose wife was accused of witchcraft, who ultimately ended up killing himself, and he just so happened to be best mates with the king. And he did all of this by the time he was 30. So it's good going. So the point of this experiment, though, was that once the group created this identity of Philip, they then decided to contact Philip through a séance. And so this is what I find really interesting about this. They knew that Philip was fictional, and they knew that he obviously didn't exist. They created him, but their goal was to, I suppose what we would say now is manifest him, just basically through sheer belief that they could, will him into existence, and that by doing this they could make some sort of contact or some kind of spiritual connection with Philip. And the whole point was that it was proving that there was a scientific method to it, that it was basically just looking at the science behind a seance, the psychology to it, and this is obviously a very extreme way to do things. So basically, after multiple attempts, they proved unsuccessful. Funnily enough, the character that they created wasn't showing up, shockingly, I know. And they tried this a few times and there was no success. So I think they were kind of thinking, maybe this experiment has kind of run its course already. It doesn't have any more legs. But Dr. Owen at this point decided, you know what, maybe we'll lean into this a little bit more. We'll make it a bit spookier. So he decided to change the experiment conditions. So he altered some of the kind of environmental variables here. He dimmed the lights to basically make it look more like a conventional seance. And he also basically tried to mimic what a seance looks like. So yeah, dimmed lights, candles, all that, had them all sit around, hands on the table, do the whole seance thing, justice effectively. Try to make it look as close to a conventional, air quotes, seance as possible. And yeah, he figured if he could make it as close to a seance as possible, that maybe they'll get a different reaction. And after he did this, immediately the participants, now these are all the same people, they started reporting feeling these kind of phantom breezes in the room, like a wind would just rush through, vibrations on the table. Some of them felt like that they heard voices in the background, and even the famous rapping that the Fox sisters talked about, that knocking that they could hear. This apparently appeared here as well, and it was rapping to basically there was answers to questions whenever they were posed to Philip. And just to bear in mind again, these questions are all being asked of Philip, the fictional character. At one point, the table was said to basically completely turn and move about the room without any human contact. There was even supposed to be audio that was recorded. There was visual issues that came up on camera as well. The participants that in the room basically documented this whole kind of seance phenomena basically as having happened, a haunting was happening. But the most important part of this is that Philip, the entity, was never said to have appeared to the participants. So they're experiencing this whole thing, this whole kind of classic seance sort of shenanigans, and Philip is never there. So that was kind of their study, and they kind of went off, and I believe they published or whatever, and they were talking about it and this, that, and the other. However, immediately they were criticized for doing this study, and they said that it basically, I think a lot of the critics are saying that it pretty much ignored the scientific method. There was no controls around variables. Apparently some of the data analysis was very vague. The methodologies were completely wrong. Even apparently just changing the environment around the seance itself is a no-no in the scientific world. I'm not a scientist, so I'll have to just go with what they say. So following this, then similar experiments were again conducted, and this was, I suppose, to replicate what had happened. And allegedly at this point, other spirits appeared called Lilith and Humphrey, and the participants in those conditions basically reported the same sort of phenomena in the room again. They said that they saw the same things, had some of the same experiences, but ultimately the results were kind of ruled as being inconclusive. That again, this is a simulated scenario. You can't really, rule down on what's already happened here. So ultimately, the critics of all of this, they point to it being a perfect example of confirmation bias. The participants that were in the room effectively interpreted phenomena that they may have been subconsciously creating themselves as evidence of Philip, to basically confirm the belief that Philip was real, and that this is effectively the same sort of phenomenon that is used to prove that Ouija boards are real, that there's this kind of subconscious involuntary movements that we do. They're called, hypnic jerks, I think is what I saw them described as online. It's basically this movement of the Ouija board's planchette through kind of subconscious kind of like group activity. So all it takes is one person to very minutely move it subconsciously, and others in the room react to it and move it at the same time. And you ultimately end up proving that the Ouija board is working when you don't even realize that you have been doing this subconsciously yourself. So yeah, the thing that I love about this though is that it doesn't really matter if the data was true or not. Like, for all intents and purposes, you have this, that the parapsychologists there effectively were able to create this ghost. They created this whole identity around Philip. They, made a history around him. They basically got these people to buy into it. They created themselves. Like, they knew he was fictional, but that didn't matter, because through manifesting and creating him, they've basically made phenomenon happen around this and effectively created this completely fictional ghost, brought it into the world, and then were adamant then that they were experiencing paranormal phenomenon when they themselves knew that what they were doing was not actually real. So yeah, I find this so interesting. Like, it's just something that just completely fascinated me. As I said earlier, I didn't know I remembered it or knew about it until I started reading into it. And then I was like, holy shit, I actually know about this. And it had completely gone out of my mind. But yeah, I love this. If any of you have had your own experiences with Ouija boards, I would love to hear about them. As I said, if you have a case for us to use a Ouija board, absolutely send it in. I'd love to hear the arguments that you make. But yeah, I would also love to hear your experiences. What's been your experiences with Ouija boards? What are your thoughts on this? The whole idea of like a fictional ghost being created. I just find it really interesting. But yeah, you can reach out to us on Instagram at the SpookyAFPod. You can email us at thespookyafpodcast@gmail.com, and you can get us on Threads and YouTube as well. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and I'd love to see, what other people's experiences are and, where you fall down on this. But with that said, I hope you are having a lovely day whenever it is that you're listening to this, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.